Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to another edition of the Father Tim Talks. This talk, what I'd like to present today, is on spirituality. It's a very appropriate theme, I think, as we're kind of in the midst of our Lenten journey. Today, what I'd like to do is, first of all, explain a little bit or develop the idea of what is spirituality. In the spiritual writers and in like seminary studies of old, spirituality would often be referred to as the interior life, the life of the soul. There are a lot of different forms and types of spirituality. It's spirituality is more or less a kind of an individualistic thing, but yet there are aspects that are shared with other people. For example, there are unique kind of aspects to a Catholic spirituality. We know of a Franciscan spirituality, and then, of course, a precious blood spirituality. So I want to do today is look a little bit at what spirituality is, a couple of the themes there, and then a couple of spiritual figures in the tradition. Often in more recent times, we have a distinction that make between spirituality and religion. Spirituality would be some kind of a connection to someone or something that's larger than ourselves. Spirituality is more of a personal experience based on that. It can be religious, but there are a lot of folks that have a spirituality that is kind of a world spirituality. And as I mentioned previously, there are lots of different spiritualities, even within one religion and those with no religion. Religion, on the other hand, comes from the Latin word religio, which means to bind. And so religion then is a group enterprise. Generally, scholars of religion note that religion has three kind of common elements. There's a common creed or set of beliefs. There's a code, which is like morals or what we ought to do because of these beliefs. And then a word that's used by scholars of religion that they share a common cult or what we would do worship. That is not to talk about the cults that we would think of in contemporary times or the occult, but I say cult is a word that scholars of religion use to describe worship. Here's a little chart that I found on the internet that kind of shows how it's for some folks, religion and spirituality are intertwined. Spirituality, again, asks the question, where do I find meaning? What gives my life purpose and meaning? How do I feel connected to others, with the world? And then, as a result of that, how then should I live out my daily life? Religion, then, as I noted in the previous slide, is what practices or rites or rituals do I follow? And it answers the question about what is right and wrong based on those beliefs. And the ultimate questions, what is true or false? The way they kind of intersect is in the level of beliefs, what I believe about God or the world. It provides some level of comfort in the kind of the trying times that we may find ourselves. It gives us the opportunity to reflect on our life and our relationships with other people, and for religious people, with God. And then also has some sort of ethics or what we ought to do or be as a result of these beliefs that we have. And then the other thing is a sense of awe, where we kind of just stand in awe before the presence of something so much greater than ourselves. So what is spirituality? Spirituality generally encompasses three main elements. There's a set of beliefs, what we believe about God and or the world. Secondly, there's a set of values that come from these beliefs. For Christians, looking on to take on the values of Jesus that would guide our lives. And then a way of life. How do these beliefs and values, how do they get lived out in our daily lives? And again, these could be really kind of apropos for those who believe in God and those who do not. There's a certain beliefs that people have just about the world, their connection to the world, which leads then to some set of values and then a way of life. So spirituality can be kind of all-encompassing. For Christians, we find some images of the Bible with regard to spirituality. One of the images that we have in the Bible is that of the journey. And we think right away of the wandering of the Hebrews to the promised land. There was a goal that they had, but it took a while for them to get there. And I think that can encourage us that we are always seeking to develop our spiritual lives, but it seems like we never get there. So the journey, on the journey to God and with one another, a biblical image. Secondly, there's the image of the struggle. Perhaps the best known is the one of Jacob struggling with the angel. The struggle can be both internal and external. In the life of Jesus, he struggled to live out his life and what he believed about his relationship with God, and met with a lot of resistance from the people of his time. The desert. We recall in some of the readings, particularly the first Sunday of Lent, that Jesus spent time in the desert. And he often, in the scriptures, relay that he goes out to be with God in the wilderness. And then we can always remember, the Hebrews wandered for 40 years in that desert. Desert, as we'll see coming up, plays a prominent role in the lives of some of the spiritual writers of the time. Darkness and light is another prominent image that comes to us. This is especially true in John's Gospel, where he's got a lot of images about the darkness and the light. The light obviously would mean following the way of Jesus and the way to God. And darkness would be those who, meaning doubt or sin. And then some of the later spiritual writers talk about darkness as the divine unknowability. God is beyond all of our attempts, and even though as humans we need to kind of grasp images and ideas about God, God is beyond all of that. We can't put God in a box. So light and darkness images that we find in the Bible. And finally, the idea of silence. This comes from Psalm 46:10, be still and know that I am God. Often in our prayer, it's a multiplication of words. And again, Jesus kind of reminds us that it's not a multiplication of words that get the attention of God. Sometimes in the spiritual life, we need to be silent and allow God to speak to us. As the psalm says, be still and know that I am God. These are just a couple of the biblical images that are often applied to the spiritual life, the interior life. Spirituality has been quite a popular topic in the recent past. They say 20, 30 years. I did a recent search on Amazon looking for books on spirituality, and I came up with over 70,000 results. And a couple of those books I've kind of put in the little graphic there to the right. I Googled spirituality, and I came up with 569 million results for the word spirituality. So you can see it's very popular in today's world. Spirituality then connects us with someone or something outside of ourselves. It allows us to see our place in the world, what makes us, gives us purpose in life. That's something outside of ourselves. But we have to have a knowledge of ourselves, know who we are, so that we can later discern whether it is, God speaking or ourselves speaking. So knowledge of self, both our strengths and our weaknesses. And we all have different strengths and different weaknesses. Spirituality then gives meaning and purpose to our lives. It allows us to to put colloquially, kind of get out of the bed in the morning. What keeps us going? That is what spirituality can provide for us. Spirituality in our own lives would encompass a life of prayer and meditation. Again, getting in touch with those elements inside of ourselves, that interior, which then get lived out in day-to-day life. Hugh of Balma was a spiritual writer in the late 13th century. And Hugh gives us like three ways or three paths of spirituality. And these were taken up and developed by a number of other spiritual writers in our tradition. Hugh says this. He says, quote, "The way to God is threefold. That is, it consists of a way of cleansing, the via purgativa, the way of purgation, in which the human mind is disposed so that it may discern true wisdom. A way of illumination, the via illuminativa, in which the mind is set on fire as it reflects with the fire of love." So it's the way in which God is illuminating our souls and drawing us more into a closer relationship with God. And then finally, the way of unity, the via unitiva, in which the mind is carried upward by God alone and led beyond reason, understanding, and intelligence. A lot of the mystics have such this relationship with God that it is beyond all understanding and reason, and so it's very difficult at times to understand this. But it's that when someone is so in union with God that the words kind of fail, and it's only kind of by analogy. So this threefold path, the way of purgation, illumination, and unity, is the first time we see this is from Hugh of Balma. And again, like I said, it gets developed in a lot of other spiritual writers in the tradition. A little bit more about what Hugh writes about the way of purgation. This again, purgation is purifying the soul from sin. Sin draws us into self, so purgation then is purifying that so that we are drawn toward the other, which is God. So that it allows us to reach our goal and growth in that relationship with God. Sin, as I mentioned, is turning into self, which prevents us from seeking God. And characteristic of this state is humility. And that's why it's important for us as we go on our spiritual lives, on our spiritual journey, that we come to a true understanding of ourselves, realizing in strengths and weaknesses. Humility is not just putting ourselves down, but it's looking honestly at ourselves to see then how we can relate to God. The way of illumination, then, is the soul is enlightened by rays of divine wisdom through meditation on Scripture and prayer. This is, again, through God's efforts. It's not, we don't kind of grasp God, but it is God that grasps us. God enlightens us. The mind becomes more and more enlightened as to spiritual things and the practice of virtue, living out, again, in day-to-day life, the things that God has enlightened us to. The practice of prayer suitable for this state is meditation on the incarnation, how God became one of us, the life of Jesus, and the mysteries of his passion, death, and resurrection. So this is coming from God. It is we are illumined by God rather than through our own efforts. Clearly, we have to work on this, but the work mainly occurs in that prior state, the purgation, where we're trying to open ourselves up to be enlightened by God. The final way is the way of union, where the soul is in union with God. And there's lots of different levels of this. Like I said previously, some of the mystics or those who have been in union with God experience God outside of normal human ways. There's more direct knowledge of God, and there's less reliant on the intermediary means. So the things of this world kind of stand. There are ways for us to know God, but the way of union, the unitive way, is more direct knowledge of God. This is so that we know God so well, so that we can come to know that what I will is what God wills for me. I think that's a profound statement, but that takes a lot of effort and a lot of time so that we know God, and again, having that honest assessment of ourselves, our strengths and weaknesses, so that we can determine what is of God and what is more of me in my own life. So the way of union is that we don't kind of rely on the intermediary means, but that we are in direct union with God. In the most extreme way, there are very few that have reached that state, but I think by way of analogy that we can come to kind of imitate that. One of the other themes comes to us. It's called the dark night of the soul. And this was kind of articulated by St. John of the Cross. You see his dates there. And I think this is one that we can all readily identify with. St. John talks about the dark night of the soul, where he says that the soul is stripped of self-assurance to be open to a new and closer relationship with God. That God seems absent from the person, that we walk in dryness, everything seems dark, but really that God is so close. Some of you may remember the rock song a number of years ago, Blinded by the Light. And that, I think, is a good analogy for a little bit of what St. John of the Cross is talking about. Again, the idea of this dark night can be really extreme, but by analogy, I think many of us have experienced this in our own spiritual lives. Joseph Campbell, I kind of missed the last part of his name there. He was a scholar of religion and mythology, and he writes, "The dark night of the soul comes just before revelation. When everything is lost and all seems darkness, then comes a new life and all that is needed." So in the dark night, we seem to be all alone. There's nothing around us that seems to make sense. But that is because God is preparing us for something new. As I mentioned, dark night, the extreme that John of the Cross talks about, really is kind of on, for the masters of spirituality. But I think for many people, they can experience something like a dark night. This, I think, is a very common experience. I know that throughout my ministry, a lot of people have shared this with me. In their own spiritual life, the old ways of prayer seem lifeless. It's dry, sort of like a desert, that they seem lost, that nothing seems to make sense anymore. This can be likened to that experience of the dark night of the soul. And that, as Joseph Campbell says, in this dark night, that God may be preparing us for something new, that we have to be open and keep struggling with that so that God may enlighten us. Now, just very briefly here, I want to look at some of the spiritual guides, some of the masters, and that are in our tradition. I think I'm going to develop a little bit more of this and some of the themes in a future presentation. Some spiritual guides. One of the things we have to do is when we're reading the spiritual guides or the spiritual masters, is we have to be aware of the time and the culture that they were writing. Some ideas that we read in spiritual writers, and particularly like in the next slide I'll have, may seem very foreign or strange to us. During the Middle Ages, there was a kind of a real disdain almost for the body and the world, that the world was the place of all evil. The body was where all evil desires came from. And I think what's appropriate for us today is to see, that God created the world and us in our bodies. And so they can be ways that we can come to see God. So it's a balanced approach, or a more holistic approach, that spiritual writers seem to talk about today. What I'm going to do, just a quick sample of some of the spiritual writers in the Christian tradition, sampling a couple just to give you an idea of some of the spiritual writers. This is an interesting one. Simon of Stylites. He lived around 390. He was from Syria, and he led a very ascetical life, very austere. He denied himself practices. Again, it was like what I was speaking before, trying to tame his body and his desires. To do that, Simon got on top of a pillar, as you see in the graphic there, where he lived for over 30 years. But he would talk to visitors as they came by. But this was a very austere life, and something to the extreme to illustrate where some of these ascetical practices came from. And we'll find a lot of these other austere practices and ascetical practices in the Middle Ages in particular. St. Hildegard of Bingen. She was a woman that lived from 1098 to 1179. She was perhaps, some have said, the most influential spiritual writer of early medieval times. Hildegard wrote about 26 visions that she had, and the other thing is that Hildegard composed about 77 songs. And if you search on YouTube, you can find some of Hildegard's songs and listen to her. One of the things that I liked about Hildegard, one of her famous sayings, is that God cannot be seen, but can be known through his creation. So Hildegard is kind of giving us a little bit more of a holistic spirituality, saying that we don't have to escape from the world or creation, but that God can be known through that, because ultimately creation and we come from God. St. Teresa of Avila, another spiritual giant during the Middle Ages. Teresa was kind of going through that kind of dark night of the soul, and she was very close friends with John of the Cross, and she found her prayer life was dry and unrewarding. In her writing, her book, Interior Castles, she encourages the readers to look into their souls to again understand themselves. That theme of understanding oneself that we have to know before we can really develop in that spiritual life and know God. What Teresa found was that her previous efforts in trying to develop her spirituality were more of herself rather than allowing God to renew and refresh her, sort of in that illuminative state that Hugh of Balma talked about. This is a quote, again, that I liked of St. Teresa. She says, "May today there be peace within. May you trust God that you are exactly where you are meant to be. May God not forget the infinite possibilities that are born of faith. May you use those gifts that you have received and pass on the love that has been given to you. May you be content knowing that you are a child of God. Let this presence settle into your bones. Allow your soul the freedom to sing, to dance, and to praise in each of you and in each and every one." Again, some very encouraging words from Teresa that came after a very long struggle in that kind of dark night that she endured in her spiritual life. Francis of Assisi, another one that I'm sure many of you know. Francis lived 1182 to 1226. As we know that Francis received the stigmata, or the 5 wounds of Christ in his body. Francis had a vision or received a revelation from God to rebuild my church, thinking that it was the church building that was kind of crumbling before him, but it was more than that, as Francis came to do more of the church of the Middle Times. Again, Francis has a close affinity with nature, as we see in his Canticle of the Sun, where he names brother sun, sister moon, and names all the animals. Again, showing that God can be known in the world around us and through nature. As a conclusion, we might want to look a little bit at some of the ways in which we might use this idea of spirituality in our own Lenten journey. What some suggestions here, what you might look at is we might search out and read some of the spiritual guides. You can find a lot of these on the internet. Just search for some of those. Again, using this time of Lent to focus more on our prayer and listening, again, so that we become in touch with the God who is wanting to speak to us. We might use the idea of fasting, and that is just in many forms, to rid ourselves of excessive entanglement to things, so that again we're not searching for things that satisfy us and in terms of the body and so, but that we are more open to God, so that we become less attached and more open to what God wishes to reveal to us. And again, as we've seen in many of the spiritual writers, use this time of Lent to get in touch with our inner self, and most of all, the God who's within, and then live that out in our lives. I wish you a fruitful journey in Lent, and as you search to strive to live out and develop your spiritual lives. And till the next time, I